Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Want to boost revenue and attract new customers? Partner with Harvest Hosts, a free marketing platform generating $50 million annually for farms and small businesses. Connect with 250,000 travelers eager to support farms like yours by offering space for one RV overnight. No hookups needed. Our members will support your farm and you keep 100% of your revenue. Visit harvesthosts.com today. Hey, Thriving Farmers. I'm Michael Kilpatrick here with yet another episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. And today's guest is Dan Brisebois, farmer, educator, and author of The Seed Farmer, a new must-read for growers looking to cultivate their own seed. Dan shares his mission to help farmers diversify with seeds, drawing on his experience at Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm and the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here again.
Absolutely. So Dan, give us a little bit of an update. Last time you came on, I believe we just focused more on the cooperative aspect of your farm and just the really that cool structure that you guys have built. We talked a little bit about seeds. Your seed business has exploded to the point you now have a seed podcast, you now have a seed book. What has that journey been like?
So, yeah, I don't exactly remember where we were, but let's assume that we were talking from zero to everything.
Yes.
Yeah. So at this point, what our seed company, so we're a vegetable farm and a seed farm. And at this point, about 55% of our revenue is coming from seeds. And we have, and just to give the listeners a perspective, we grow vegetables for about 500 weekly CSA baskets. So it's a fairly large CSA that we're running. So the seeds, and in the seeds, maybe about a third of the seed revenue is coming from our online store, and then maybe 2/3 is coming from seed racks that we have in businesses across Quebec and Eastern Canada. And so this is a pretty big. It's definitely a big scaling up over the years. Like 10 years ago, we were, we had 10 years ago, we had just launched our online seed store, maybe a couple of years before that. And so this is really definitely a big scaling up in that regards. However, the growing side is not necessarily huge. So we grow on an acre or less for the seeds that go into our catalog. We do contract a fair amount of seed from other seed companies, the seed growers, and we buy seed from other seed growers in other climates, and we buy a little bit of wholesale seed. But we're still growing 50 to 70% of the seed that we sell on that acre. So it's there's definitely a different scale in what you can do with seed in a seed company versus vegetables on a CSA.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so then you're doing packets, you have the online store. What types of, and I think the other thing too, you're doing seed breeding too. You've done some really cool, you're working on some really cool things. You have put out some really cool things.
Yeah, so I kind of focused on the business part because I know you like the thriving part. But what I love is the growing. And so we've been working on breeding projects since the beginning, so like 20 years or so. And probably so some of it's intentional, some of it's accidental. Whenever I see something that's crossed up, I'll definitely keep the seed from it and grow it out. But one of the projects that excites me the most, and that seems to excite people the most, is we took a black radish and we crossed it with a watermelon radish. So black radish is black on the outside, white on the inside. Watermelon radish is green on the outside, red on the inside. And we crossed it. And after many years of selection, we've wound up with black radishes that are red on the inside. We call them our black crimson radishes. And something that we weren't expecting when we did this cross is we also wound up with a bunch of purple radishes. So we have these black, black as black radish on the outside, and this deep purple, like this violet purple on the inside.
Wow.
And they're just stunning. And so at this point, it's about 80% stable. That means that if we grow out 100 of them, maybe like 50 are fantastic, 30 kind of the color's a bit blurred on the inside, and then 20 are doing other stuff. And so this is the part that I love doing is just crossing things that you're not supposed to cross and seeing what happens. And some of it's for fun. A lot of it, like with the radishes, every year, there's a lot of radishes that you eliminate from the population and they wind up going into the CSA basket or into a kimchi pot. And
Yes.
so a lot of our breeding is done in a way to keep, to provide food also for our CSA, to pay for the land that we're using to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. That process, as you said, is very long and tedious, and you have to have a thriving business to be able to make that all possible, because it is something that can take a very long time to have an actual viable variety.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can get to something fairly almost stable in 5 to 6 years, but you have to be paying attention, and it takes more time to just keep working on it. So that's a lot of time that you're investing in it.
Yeah. I remember when we first started, we cut open one of those watermelon radishes, and I can't remember if it literally was the black with the pink inside or if it was something else. But it was one of those. I think I called my Johnny's rep and say, "Hey, I've got this, and I don't really know what to do." And of course, I killed it like a month later, in the greenhouse. And but it was one of those things that it was super cool. And obviously, there was no book out there at that point to tell me exactly how to save this seed. But you do have a book out now.
I do have a book out, yeah, called The Seed Farmer. And
Yeah. And in there, you share literally how easy it is to grow seeds.
yeah, it's you know, so I wrote this book, aimed at market gardeners, because I know that we're all really busy in August and September when you got to be doing the work. And I tried to write this book, or I wrote this book to kind of show folks how easy it can be to get into it, and to really lay out the steps of how you can start growing a seed on your farm without being overwhelmed, while still maintaining your other business stuff, your other growing intact. And so the first third of the book is really about your first seed crops and how to do it so that it doesn't take too much time, and that's so that you're learning a lot. And then the last third of the book is how to do a better job once you start getting a little bit more experience, including tricks on how to breed vegetables on your own farm, how to do your own selections.
Yeah. And by accident, a couple of years ago, we grew out some arugula and kale, red Russian kale. And I'm actually looking out my window right now. There's a crop of carrots outside my window. And throughout that crop of carrots is still some red Russian kale that popped back, a little bit of arugula. But we actually collected some of that seed, and it's amazing. Again, there's definitely some things you want to pay attention to. It was by utter neglect, but we collected a fair amount of seed, and that seed keep coming back in that strip because we let it go too long. But it's amazing, A, how much you can produce from a small area, and B, it's like growing your own plants.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I think arugula and red Russian kale are really good things to start with. One, they don't cross with a lot of other plants. They're usually
Yes.
just growing one type of arugula, you're growing one type of red Russian kale, though they do cross with rutabaga red Russian kale. It doesn't cross with the other kales, but it would cross with rutabaga if you have some
Interesting.
flowering. But if you're in a climate where your red Russian kale will overwinter, and they're gonna put up some flower stalks, you can cut those sprouts before they go to flower. So they're delicious. And you can get a lot of seed off of a small area, off of 10 or 20 feet of arugula or red Russian kale, you might get a pound or two of seed. I'm not 100% sure on the numbers. I'm doing that math in my head.
No, it sounds about right. That sounds absolutely about right. But I like the thing is, in the fall, you can cut the red Russian kale twice. You let it overwinter as long as you care for it. And then you can take some of the flower bits, and then you can let the rest of it just go to seed.
Definitely. And then depends how much you use. But I mean, if you're just growing red Russian kale for bunching, you have enough forever. And if you're putting it in your salad mixes, it's going to look just as good as what you started with. And it's especially red Russian kale is something that you don't have to worry about badly selecting it. It's going to do pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then, all right, someone says, all right, you've talked about a couple crops. Talk about a few other crops that may be like tomatoes. They seem relatively easy. Kind of share a little bit about if you were to thinking about doing tomatoes, how you'd go with that.
So yeah, so I would just take a step back and say the way so the middle half of the book is I go crop by crop, and the way
Mm,
that I lumped them is by the type of crop it is, and from
yes,
easiest to hardest, and um, or easiest to more complicated. And what I think is the easiest for a market grower is the fruiting crops, because you're already growing the part that has the seed in it, like those little bits in the tomato. Those are the seeds,
correct.
right? So to get it to seed, you just have to do an extra step. And if you're just using seed for if you're just harvesting seed for yourself, you need what, 5, 6 tomato plants? A tomato,
Correct.
that's not going to have an impact on your market harvest. And so in that case, you just open them up. They have to be ripe. You open them up, you
Mhm.
scoop out the insides, you put them in a container. And in the case of tomato seeds, it's not true for all crops, but tomato seeds, you have to let them ferment for a couple days to get funky mold on the top. And then when the seed sinks to the bottom, you know the seed is ready. And during that fermentation, it dissolves this little membrane around the seed, like a gelatinous coat that inhibits germination. And so when the seed sinks, you could fill up the container with water. The seed's on the bottom. You pour off the light stuff, and then you put out the seed. Maybe you catch it in a colander, and
Mhm.
uh, and then you dry it, and then you can use it next year. Now, one thing to highlight is if you're growing hybrid tomato seeds, you're going to get something different than next year, because hybrids are a cross of two lines. And so there's a lot of diversity. Whereas if you're growing an open pollinated tomato, then most of the plants you grow are going to look pretty much like the parent plants. Um,
Mm.
so fruiting crops. So tomatoes are easy. Peppers are even easier. You don't even have to ferment them. You just open them up, take the seed out. The one thing with peppers to note is that sweet peppers and hot peppers can cross pollinate. So even if it's just 1 or 2%,
Mm.
that's too much in the case if you have some hot peppers in your sweet peppers. And
Mhm.
and so in that case, I'd recommend growing your sweets and your hots 1 or 200 feet apart, and then you can harvest them. And then if you get something, so if you're growing two types of hot peppers and you get a little bit of crossing in them, you're probably talking about like 1 or 2 plants out of 100 that are going to be crossed. Not
Mm.
and they're gonna be edible. They'll still be spicy, as long as you didn't cross them with sweets. And you might see something new that nobody has at the market, and it's like an exciting thing to talk about. And that's really where plant breeding begins, is when you pay attention to those accidents. But if you don't like the accidents, you just harvest all the fruit, you sell it, and you keep seed from the plants that you do like.
Mhm.
So that's another one that's just really easy.
Yeah. Okay. Back to tomatoes here. Um, they self-pollinate, correct? Tomatoes typically
They
self-pollinate.
predominantly self-pollinate. Yeah.
Okay. And if it's an heirloom variety, you can just keep saving the seed every single year. Now, the question is, do I select the nicest, prettiest looking fruit? Is there any aspect to that?
Well, I would say rather than the fruit, it's the plant you want to look at. Because if
Ah,
you like all the fruit on the same plant have the same genetics. So if you have an
yes.
ugly plant with a lot of ugly fruit and one nice fruit, that nice fruit has the same genes as the rest. So like if you really want to do a little bit more work, at the beginning, like you can have some flagging tape or like just a little flag,
Mhm.
and you mark your earliest tomato plants. So then you'd be selecting for what is going to be the earliest over time. And then you if there's some plants that are have less disease, you pay attention to those. You can pay attention to yield. It can be hard though if you keep picking them to know which is the heavy
Yes.
plants. Um, and then the last thing is you could taste them too, and they don't all taste the same. So those are things that you can select for. And but you're looking at the whole picture. I mean, if the only thing you have is that if you've already harvested the tomatoes and all you have is a tomato, that's better than not doing it at all. But if you want to do these extra steps, you can also.
And you're gonna have a much better quality. You're gonna be selecting, it's gonna be a much cleaner, better quality plant.
Definitely. Yeah.
Um, and that's why, like, let's say you go to a seed company, we won't name anyone's, but they always say like, "Hey, this is our own strain that we've been selecting," and so that's when you're like, "Okay, that's what they've probably been doing, is checking the plant and
Yeah.
the earliness and stuff like that." Gotcha. What would you say of like the normal vegetables we grow are the hardest? I mean, Brussels sprouts seem really hard to me.
Yeah, well, so they are harder. They have to overwinter. So, like in our climate, it's a lot harder than if you were out west, where it's going to overwinter much easier. But
Mhm.
I think something else about Brussels sprouts is how much Brussels sprout seed do you use? Do you use 1,000 Brussels sprout seeds a year? Like, if
Mm.
that's the case, that's not where I'd focus. But so the heading brassicas are some that I probably would avoid. Also, you don't want to do a bad selection job on those. I think what's also difficult can be roots like carrots or beets. If you're going to go for them, so they're biennials. That means they take 2 years. You got to first
Yes.
grow the root, make sure it's nice, and then you grow it a second year. That second year is not necessarily particularly difficult. It's just you have to get it through the winter, and it's just going to take longer. The other one that I think is really tricky on a market garden context is all your squashes. And
Ah,
like if you're growing for CSA or farmers market and you have two color zucchini and you have acorn and delicata squash and pie pumpkins, those all cross up. And like you'd have to grow them at least maybe 1,500 feet apart to really see no
hmm.
thing, maybe 1,000 feet. But I mean, that's a lot of extra work. And so the squash family is where I'd be more careful. Now there like I don't know how in deep we want to go. There's three species of squash and
Yeah.
like
Well,
butternut.
okay. So I'm looking at your book here, and you say my unrecommendation: do not choose squash as your first seed crop. And you split the difference. You said at least 1,200 feet.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, but I mean, I think it's all in the book. So I mean, again, I've read a fair amount of what you've written before, just through like your blog and stuff like that, and you have a really easy to understand writing um, style. So I'd highly recommend folks get the book. And I think I think the aspect here too is maybe you don't really think you want to do seeds, but as a farmer, I think it's very valuable for you to understand A, what it takes to grow seed, and B, the cycle and things like that. I think it'll just make you a better farmer overall.
I totally agree. I totally agree. When you don't, so for sure, I think everybody should grow seed. But that being said, I think understanding how seed works means that you understand more what a crop failure might mean in your seed company. You might understand more the risk you have if you're relying on specific varieties that are not always there and why they aren't there.
Mhm.
So I think understanding more that seed cycle will make you just make better choices when you're ordering your seeds. It'll make you maybe a little bit more appreciative of the seed companies, maybe a little bit more forgiving when they don't have exactly what you're
Yes.
looking for.
Well, if we were to back up to something like the Nelson carrot seed,
Yeah.
that was a much loved variety, and then Beho dropped it, and eventually I was got to talk with Jan, who's one of the breeders there, about it, and he just broke down to us the economics of how it only produced a crop like 1 in 3 years. The seed crop rate was like 1/8 or 1/10 of everything else, and just how economically awful it was. And even if they were to charge like 3 times the amount of money, it still didn't make sense, even though it was literally one of the best carrots out there.
Yeah. And yeah, so the seed farmers growing your seeds, they're running farms, and so they have to they're susceptible to all the same weather stuff that we're susceptible, though they might be growing in better climates in some areas for that. But yeah, and what you're talking about, the Nelson, that was a hybrid. So they had, and a hybrid is produced by crossing two lines, and in the case of carrots, there are two lines that are fairly inbred, so they're actually quite difficult to maintain. So yeah, we're really at the we're really at the
Yeah.
at vagaries of over time, these, like especially carrots, not it's not true of all hybrids, but many varieties over time will not produce as well as they used to, and then they need to have a new hybrid come in the market. And there are great seed companies doing work to make sure that happens, but sometimes it takes longer, and sometimes there's challenges. And if you have an open pollinated variety that you're working on and you keep, you're going to be more resilient in that regards, and you're going to be able to supply yourself and your community. And then, I mean, there's also times where you might have a pandemic or something like that, and supply
Yes.
chains get disrupted, and suddenly everybody realizes they should have their own garden, and they're all competing for the same seed, and shipping problems come, and then you don't have the seed you want. So that's another kind of situation where it's nice to have a little resilience.
hmm hmm Absolutely. So what would you say, or like, if someone just gets excited about this, do you have like a couple tips for them for the first time seed grower to kind of get started, to start thinking as a seed farmer?
Yeah. So the first thing is to start small. This is actually my advice in almost everything farming, but start small. And when somebody wants to get into seed, they're often really excited. Well, they find out about all the biodiversity lost, or maybe they want to get in contact with their ancestral crops, or maybe they're just you're worried about they're worried about our seeds, our food system, and know that seeds at the base. And so often when you get into seed, you want to save all those things, and that's not something you can do in 1 year if you don't know what you're doing. So when you start growing seed, the main thing is to learn how to grow seed. Like that's your main goal initially. So don't take it. Not gonna say don't take it too seriously. I mean, don't worry about the rules too much. Don't worry about cross pollination too much. Don't worry about having too many plants. Even if you have 5 plants, that's good. And I would say start with 1 to 3 crops. Don't start with a bunch. Start to 1 to 3 crops. Start pretty small, and you want to pay attention to what it's like when is the seed ready, how you get it out. Like, just learn those things, because it's a craft, and there's techniques and skills. There's also tools, but the tools aren't as important as the skills and the techniques. And if you've never cleaned seed, cleaning that pound of red Russian kale or arugula you were talking about, that's going to take you an hour or 2 hours. If you know
Mm,
what you're doing, if you've cleaned seed a few times, it takes you 4 minutes to clean that amount of seed. And
yes.
so initially you're just learning the skills. And the other thing is, make sure you use the seed that you saved in your garden the next year. Now, don't like, if you're growing tomatoes and you kept your own tomato seed, I wouldn't be surprised if it's safe, but I would say just grow 5 or 10% of the tomatoes from your own seed. Don't grow it all from your own seed. Treat it like if you were trialing a new variety you got out of a seed catalog. And and if it does well, the next year you grow more, and then the year after you grow more. And so you want to gain more confidence with your seed by doing that. And so that's what I'd say, is just start small, a couple varieties, use that seed, and then use it more and more. And that's really what I would focus on. And I would focus on stuff that doesn't cross-pollinate too much. Tomatoes, peppers, so easy. Salad greens, a little bit more complicated, but still pretty fun. And
hmm
yeah, just start with a couple things.
Yeah. And you've got some great pictures in this book too. Like, one of the things, obviously, if you're trying to grow onions, is sometimes the seed heads will fall over. So you actually use Hortonova flower netting, which is actually a really cool idea.
Yeah, yeah, and so one of the feedbacks I've gotten from a number of people who've read this book, like the early copies, had
hmm
been the pictures, that they wish they had had pictures like that when they were learning how to grow seed. And there's pictures of almost everything in there. And yeah, we use Hortonova on the onions. So the onions, you grow onions the first year the same way you'd grow any storage onion, and
hmm
you have to get it through the winter, and then the next year we planted out the whole bulb, and then and maybe you've probably seen that in your cold room, where you have those green sprouts coming out, the green onion coming out of it. If you plant that
Yes.
in the ground, it will go to flower, and you'll get seed out off of it. And it's really, I mean, it's also a great pollinator source, or not source, but it's a great food for pollinators. They're going to come for
Correct.
it.
Yes.
The thing we haven't talked about is, it's amazing to watch that seed maturing on the onion plant, and then to take the plant and you just take the flower and you kind of shake it and the seeds fall out. Like, just to see how that happens, there's a real sense of satisfaction that happens with that. And then if you grow those seeds and you get onions after it, you just feel so powerful, like you're part of of just this whole this life project that we're part of. You get to really see it.
Yes, absolutely. One thing that well, actually, I'm not growing it. One of our employees has been growing his own version of Coxcomb celosia for about a decade.
Mhm.
And every year he literally tosses the seeds off his porch, and every year they grow up beautifully and he saves the seeds. So he brought me a whole bin, and we actually want to kind of, because we are ecom where we sell all the plants and stuff, we were going to give a free packet to people that buy through that. um have you tried cleaning that before? Have you done
Like celosia seed.
yes.
Yeah, so celosia seed is fairly small.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I would do, and so it's a bit bigger than amaranth seed,
Yes.
but what I would start off with is I would take a window screen. So that,
Okay.
and
Yep.
if the seed fits through the window screen, you'll see that almost all the bits will be on top and the seed will almost be perfectly clean underneath. So
Ah.
that's the first thing I would try. Um, if it doesn't, well, in either case, the next thing I would do is I would set up indoors. I'd set up a box fan, and
Mm-hmm.
I put a tarp on the ground in front of it because if you
Yeah.
get too ambitious, you want to really catch the seed that you blew all over and then try again. But I put a tarp on the ground and then a couple Rubbermaid bins or harvest bins with no holes, on the
Mm-hmm.
next to that fan, and I would just take a container and I'd pour the seed. And so the wind is blowing towards the bins, and I'd pour the seed into the wind, and the heaviest stuff's going to fall closest to the fan, and that's going to be the seed, and it gets quite clean with that. So
Mm.
so those
Mm-hmm.
that's the same techniques. Now I wouldn't like for the red Russian killer arugula, it's not going to fit through a window screen, but if you
Yes.
have a spaghetti strainer or colander, it'll probably fit through that, and you'll get rid of most of the seed pods, and then you could just winnow it with a fan. And if you have three speeds on it, you can vary that. And if you want to get really tricky, you put two box fans, one next to the one behind the other, and that gives you a bit more wind power and more speed combinations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, and then for packaging this, is that something where, I mean, you're just using a tiny little scoop? One of the things that I think we used here on the farm for actually doing like scallions in the greenhouse was like a reloading set because they had all these different little sizes of scoops. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming you have a machine for this at this point.
We do have a machine, but we still do a surprising amount by hand. And when you were talking about
Oh,
reloading, so you're talking about like gunpowder scoops?
yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so there's a set of yellow gunpowder scoops with like 15 or 20 different
That's what we've got.
sizes. It's like 15 or 20 bucks off of like you
Yeah.
get it at a lot of different places online. And so that is, I think, the best starting point for seed packing. And so probably the easiest if you're at like a DIY at home, like just starting, probably the easiest is to just choose the number of seeds or amount of seeds in your pack based on the different scoops that are there. And you can scoop it out, and then you could count. Although in the case of celosia, you're going to be counting a lot. Um, but yeah, so that's a really easy way to scoop seeds. So we use those scoops, and then we use a lot of other scoops, different fractions of
Mm-hmm.
teaspoons, tablespoons, and we probably have like about 100 different sizes. And we know what seed weight we're aiming for. Well, so we'll start off by looking at what we packed the seed in with last time, and we'll take that scoop and we'll calibrate. We'll have a little scale and we'll weigh 10 or 20 scoops to see if it's still the same, because each seed lot, even if it's the same variety, each seed lot can have different size seeds. And then over time, I'm not sure if it's moisture or what, but seeds can change a little bit, and so it's good to calibrate each time between packing seed lots.
Absolutely. Well, seed size changes and all that, which you actually bring up now a good point is, okay, so germ testing, let's talk a little bit about kind of how that works and what people should be paying attention to there.
So, germ testing is can be very easy. It can be as easy as, like, so if you start seedlings in your nursery, you already know what you need to do. There's certain temperatures that you're looking for. Certain things do better at warmer temperatures and cooler temperatures, and you can do a germ test just by if your nursery is still up and running, you just put a open flat with some potting soil. It doesn't have to be much, and then you could make a trench, and then you could either count all the seeds you're putting in or just sprinkle them in. If it's just like for at home test, sprinkle some seeds in, and then you water it in, and then you just wait till it germinates, and then you see how much comes in. To be a little bit more precise, you could use something like coffee filters, or we actually use blotter paper in Petri dishes. But you could use coffee filters that are moistened, and then you're putting in Ziploc bags, and you'd count out 50 or 100 seeds. Those are nice numbers because they're easy. If it's 50 seeds, if 48 germinate, then you multiply by 2, you got 96% germination. If you do 100 seeds, it's really easy to get the percent germination on that.
Mhm.
and you might know this as a grower, and if you don't know, this is really important to know because it'll change the way you run your nursery. But not all plants want to germinate at the same temperature, and there's sort of three general groups. The most common is they want to be at about 30 Celsius. That's about like 85 Fahrenheit during the day, and about 20 Celsius. So that's about 65, 68 Fahrenheit during the night. And so that's like all your tomatoes, peppers, most of the brassicas are in that group. And then there's another group that wants to be at about 20 cents Celsius, so about 65 Celsius all the time. And so that, let me think what's in there. Is that onions in there? I'm thinking the other group is the one that's 15 Celsius all the time. So that's more like what is that? It's about 58, 60 Fahrenheit.
Yes, correct. Yes.
And stuff like spinach, maybe lettuce. No, lettuce is lettuces are more than 20 C. But
lettuce too can be if it's primed or not, and the age of the seed too. Like if you get really fresh seed, I think it's older seed lots you kind of have to kind of mess with to get them to germinate sometimes.
Yeah, but so knowing the right temperature will be good. So with the 20-30, the stuff that's 30 Celsius, 20 Celsius, we have a little fridge that we've set up. But you could also set up in a cooler and you put like an incandescent light bulb in there, and that creates your heat source the same way like if you keep chickens through the winter. And so we have it on a timer to have it, and a thermostat to have it at 30 Celsius during the day and 20 at night. And like you can get these timers and thermostats from anything like hydroponics store. And it's pretty simple. We have the stuff that's 20 Celsius. We just have that at room temperature, and the stuff that's at 15 Celsius, we put it in a wine cooler, like it's like a wine fridge that has no wine in it, and it just keeps that at a cooler temperature, and they germinate well. So those are knowing the right temperature is probably the most important thing to do a good germ test.
Now, one thing you mentioned is different temperatures at night and day, correct?
Yeah.
So if we're trying to just germinate something to grow for just the food aspect, is that something we should also be trying to achieve for these, is changing the temps for night and day? Or is it a 24-hour cycle? Is it a light cycle? I'm just are you trying to match like the outdoor conditions?
Well, it's some of them need light, but most don't. So it's like 8 hours of warmth of hotter temperatures, and then 16 hours of cooler temperatures. If you're growing in a cool climate like we are, you kind of have that, right? Because you have your furnace set to be warmer during the day, and at night you cool down a little bit to save on cost. And if you create a germination chamber, you probably have it running a little bit hotter during the day. You don't you don't have to. If you can't do that alternating cycle, in that case, you probably want to have it about 25 C, maybe a little bit less than that. So that would be something like around 78, 80 Fahrenheit is probably the place that you'd want to be. Maybe 75, 78 Fahrenheit is where you'd want to be keeping those. But if you can do that alternation, like if you're in a cold climate like we are, and you're able to get your seedlings, your germinating seeds to 86 Fahrenheit during the day, they're going to germinate much quicker than if you can't. And if you're in a sunny period, it just might get that hot normally. But if it's overcast, you do want to have some way to heat it. And that's why a lot of growers will have germination chambers in their nursery, to just, you have your trays in a smaller area, maybe even stacked up. And then the moment they germinate, you can pull them out, because once they've germinated, they don't need those temperatures anymore. They'll grow well at cooler temperatures.
Yeah. And onions particularly too that's one of those things where you put them in your nursery, they'll sit there for 2 or 3 weeks. If you don't have them at that right 86 degrees, eventually they will germinate. But if you put them in, that germ chamber for 48, 96 hours, it's amazing how much faster that plant comes and how much stronger it comes.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the book too, you also go through flowers as well.
Yeah. So that's so fruiting crops, I think, are the easiest for market growers. But if you're growing cut flowers, that's a definite a definite easy one to go for harvesting seed. Now, it's good to know if it's an open pollinated or if it's a hybrid. If it's open pollinated, I go for it. And then the other thing is most flowers, there's not a lot of information out there about what crosses easily or not, but you should assume that most of it crosses. Like those flowers attract so many insects. And if you're really interested in a specific color palette, then you might have a hard time keeping those varieties true to type if you're growing many varieties. But if you don't care as much about a specific color palette, then a little crossing will actually give you, some interesting new flowers and colors to see, and then you can afterwards select for that. So going back to the breeding, but a lot of like stuff like calendula, nigella, poppies, strawflower, the seed is just there. The big thing is you can't deadhead them all. If you leave a few, they're going to go to seed. If you're using it just for your own self, you only need a few seed heads on a number of plants, and you're going to be able to get. I mean, it depends how many plants you're growing out, but it doesn't take far. And then something like zinnias is a little bit more complicated, but it's not impossible to do. If you're in a drier climate, it's easier. If in a wet climate like we have, it can be a little bit more frustrating, but you let the head kind of dry down till it's like a brown, dead looking thing, and you can pull out the middle of the flower, and you can see seeds at the bottom. And that's where it's important to pay attention to what seeds look like when you're sowing them, because that's how you know when you got them later on, is if you find that same part in the flower. And I'm speaking a bit tongue in cheek, but I am serious too. Like that's sometimes people don't know what they're looking for, but it's ultimately going to look the same as what you started with.
Absolutely. And then you talk about dill and cilantro too, which that's always something that I always, you cut off, your first couple bunches, and then you have this whole area of plants that are starting to bolt on you, and it always feels like a waste. You do say something here, which is interesting though, is that frequently you will struggle with low germ rates on those two crops. And is that just because we don't have the same conditions, or?
So I wish I had that answer, because I would give it, like I would figure it out myself. The umbel family, so that's the family with carrots and parsley and parsnips, and then also cilantro and dill, is one that I haven't had as much success with. And I don't like, so we definitely have a wet climate, and it's hard to get the seed, I think, to dry to the perfect level in the field. I have had some really good cilantro and dill lots, but I've had some really not good ones too. And I'm not sure. That one I don't have the secret for it. But even if it germinates, so if it germinates at 60%, I can't sell that, but I can sow that on my own farm. And so if you're using your own seed, you don't have to have the seed as clean as if you're going to sell it, and it doesn't have to germinate as well as if you're going to sell it. It's just, if you need to know roughly what the germination rate is, and then you can increase your seed density to compensate for the lower germ, and it'll do fine. And often that stuff can be like, what I found with some things is the germ test, I have a hard time doing it, and then I sow it and it looks like 100% pop up out of the ground. So often being in the soil makes things do a little bit better than they might in a germ test.
Well, and I think there's so much we don't understand about seeds at this point. I know, like, when you put things in the ground, there's like the different acids and bacteria and all that kind of stuff which interact with the seed and change it up.
Yeah, yeah. And I do want to highlight that most of our germ tests are quite reliable, and we trust them.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's not like it's a total shot in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you want to share?
About seeds or in general?
In general. I think you answered all my seed questions. I'm literally looking at your book too, so I'm planning on reading through it. But yeah, just anything you want to share before we go?
Well, the book's coming out November 26th, so it's probably going to be out by the time this episode comes.
Yeah.
And so the book, we've talked about a lot what's in the book. There's also a lot about, crop planning and seed yields, which is something that I have found hard to find in other seed books. And so there's some really great seed books out there. And in this book, I'm like, there's, the seed to seed book. There's the organic seed grower, the seed garden. These are phenomenal books. I haven't tried to recreate them. There's a little bit of stuff that you'll find in both of those books, but I've tried to fill in the blanks and really address how it is a market grower is going to incorporate seed in their farm. And I've tried to cover the yields and the thinking behind that. So that's what makes this book different than a lot of those others fantastic books. Other things, and this book mainly comes. So I mean, it comes from all kinds of experiences that I've learned, but it's really presented through my eyes and my experience. But I also have the Seed Farmer podcast that comes out every 2 weeks, more or less. And in there, I interview other seed growers. And that's where trying to get kind of similar conversation, a bit like what we're having here, but kind of going into people's seed stories and then getting in depth into different crops. And I interview people from all over the US, Canada, and abroad. So that's another thing that I do. And we haven't talked about it in this one. I think we talked about it more in the last episode. I run the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy, where I do
Yes.
work with helping people crop plan and better at their farm management. So those are the other hats that I have.
All right. So if they want to find this info, where should they go?
They should go to danbrisebois.com. You could probably put the link in the
Yep, we'll put it in the show notes.
and they'll find this all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a delight to have you on and discuss your latest project. And this book looks fantastic, and I can't wait for it to come out.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me again.
Absolutely.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.